Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Sunless Sea as of the Steam free weekend that's been going on of it. It is currently January 30th of 2016, so if you're watching this in the future, your mileage may vary on whether or not it's a free weekend. As far as the game itself goes, though, it's basically what has come to be described as a rogue-lite. It has roguelike elements, but is not actually a roguelike. And it is focused on exploration. I've seen a lot of comparisons to FTL, and that's a lot easier to compare to because this is an exploration-based game with roguelike elements. There is permadeath in this, but the main difference here is that FTL focuses more on its mechanics, whereas this focuses more on its writing. And you have to understand going into this thing that this is actually set in an established universe. The Fallen London setting that Failbetter Games used for this particular game is actually something that they've had put together for quite some time. It's actually apparently won awards for the quality of the writing in it, but I have not experienced any of that stuff yet. There was a browser game that they put together where you basically explore Fallen London, but I didn't play that, and apparently there's other writings they've been doing. This apparently was a Kickstarter success, and it just kind of sailed under my radar, pun intended. But now, thanks to the free weekend, I got a chance to actually delve into this thing and play it for a couple of attempts at playthroughs. The other attempt is what you're seeing here, and I haven't quite finished it yet. But the previous two attempts I made at trying to sail around the Untersee, I guess is how you pronounce it. It's spelled in a German manner, Unter, and then a Z, and then two E's. So I'm guessing it's Untersee. But me being somebody who speaks German, it makes me want to pronounce it Untersee. And it always drives me crazy when I'm just trying to figure out exactly how this thing is supposed to be pronounced. They don't have any voice acting in this game at all, so you don't get any pronunciations of the actual term or anything like that. And so I'm just going to bite the bullet and start pronouncing it in the German manner. If that's not correct, well, too bad. I'll get corrected, whatever. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the game proper. As far as visuals go, this is a 2D top-down game, and generally speaking, the artwork in this is actually pretty good. There's a definite gothic, steampunk, fantasy vibe going on that actually works out pretty well in the game's favor, considering that it is primarily about exploring and discovery, and when you come across these really weird things, you're like, ooh, that's interesting, I want to explore that and find out what it is. Granted, the color scheme is a bit drab, but then again, this is trying to go with gothic stylings, and it does actually take place underground as well, so I guess it stands to reason that there would be an awful lot of gray in this thing. They do their best to try to spice the color palette up occasionally, but generally speaking, you're going to be dealing with a lot of gray and just kind of a light green tinge. And again, it works okay for the game, but it does kind of get tiring after a while simply by nature of you just kind of being overexposed to it. Now that said, you're going to be interacting with two main things throughout the game. The first is the overworld map, which is where you're going to see all the gray. While there are occasionally other ships and occasionally sea creatures that you'll run into, there's really not much in the way of animations for the overworld map, so it does end up feeling kind of static. They do try to throw in a few things to spice up the overworld map, like the vortices that you'll run into on occasion, but generally speaking, it's pretty static and frankly kind of boring. The other thing you'll be interacting with is the gazetteer, which is just text. Lots of text, occasionally an image or two, and it's basically just a series of menus that you can click through whenever you're dealing with story stuff or the various shops or anything like that. Whenever you need to go and look at your cargo, when you need to upgrade your ship, or when you make port or anything like that, that is all done through the gazetteer. And it's a simple, easy to work with series of menus that doesn't really get in your way and in fact is pretty intuitive, but it doesn't really help the rather static nature of this game's visuals. Again, the artwork itself is pretty good and the art direction definitely fits what they're going for, but definitely don't go into this thing expecting any sort of complex visuals or cutscenes or anything like that. I have not run into anything of that nature throughout the entirety of the time I've played this. Similarly, the sound design is pretty utilitarian. You don't have any voice acting at all, so again, problems with pronunciation. But as far as the sound effects themselves go, they suffice and they don't really do anything more. There's not a single sound effect in there that I went, oh, this really stands out. The cannons don't sound particularly beefy, the explosions don't sound particularly beefy, they're just decent and nothing more. So at least they work, I'll give them that. But the lack of voice acting means that the majority of what you're going to be hearing is some pretty bland sound effects mixed in with the generally pretty solid music. It definitely fits the vibe they're going for, and it actually changes up depending on where you are. When you're out into the further reaches of the Untersee, you find that the music actually starts to become more dark and mysterious and actually kind of foreboding. Whereas when you get closer to Fallen London, you don't get so much of the dark, mysterious, foreboding stuff that you get further out. Instead, you get more forlorn and actually kind of depressing. So they definitely did a good job with the music, at least. It certainly fits the tone that they're going for, and it really does help to create a lot of atmosphere in this game where it otherwise wouldn't exist. Now, with all the presentation stuff out of the way, we can get to the real meat of this thing, which is the writing and the gameplay. I say writing because story doesn't really exist in Sunless Sea so much as you create a story based on the various events that happen to you. Now, the basic premise of the game is the same no matter what you do. You're always a captain of a ship that is sailing around the Untersee. And the idea is that you're going to constantly be exploring, discovering things, completing various quests, trading with other ports. Occasionally you'll fight either a pirate or a sea monster or things like that. And you're going to be doing that for the vast majority of the game. What changes things up is, of course, the events that happen to you, as well as the backstory that you give your character. And during the character creation phase, you can select both your background, which will give you different stat bonuses, as well as your objective. The objective can be something as simple as just being the greatest explorer to ever sail the Untersee. Or it could be something like finding wherever your father met his demise and recovering his bones. Or perhaps you just want to amass a huge amount of wealth. Well, whatever you pick, that determines your win condition. And it can also help determine which side quests you'll actually run into. Because, for example, if you're looking for your father's bones, then you will actually have quests related to that particular win condition, whereas the others wouldn't have access to that. So it's kind of an interesting way to differentiate your character from other characters that you've made. And even going through the various events and doing things differently can actually determine what your character's legacy really is. But what you'll find, regardless, is that the strength of this game is really more in how well written a lot of the events are and how well the world is built up. Despite knowing basically nothing about the setting, the quality of the writing is such that it doesn't really matter so much if you haven't actually seen the prior Fallen London stuff, because this is really more about exploring the Untersee and finding out all of these weird things that are there. And as you're exploring, you're going to run across all sorts of odd events and odd characters that are scattered throughout the islands, and you'll be able to interact with these people on different levels. Some characters you'll be able to have a long working relationship with. Other characters you might try to do something with. For example, there's a tomb colonist who you can take to Venderbite, and it actually can have wildly different outcomes just depending on the situation. You take them there and, oh, it turns out they're a criminal, or it turns out that they wanted to have a party, or they just straight up died and turned into dust or something like that. Any number of weird things can happen when you're dealing with all these different characters scattered throughout the Untersee. And that's where all the really interesting stuff of the game is. It's in the writing. It's how they present these things. The characters talk in kind of eccentric ways. The descriptions of things are rather vivid and paint an excellent picture of what exactly is going on. The writing in this game is great. But then there's the gameplay, which honestly almost feels like an afterthought. The way they've set it up, you have your ship. And this can be upgraded over time. You can find all sorts of different ships available for purchase. They cost a ridiculous amount of money, of course, but they will give you access to different capabilities. The one you start with basically has a deck gun and nothing else. Eventually you can get fore and aft guns as well that actually have different effects, and so you can have more than one weapon on these upgraded ships, but it takes a really long time to get those ships. So that can get incredibly frustrating when you're trying to basically grind up to get a new ship. And you also have to grind up quite a bit to get to the point where you can really pass on a significant amount of your legacy to the next character. They have a system set up in this where when your previous character dies or actually manages to succeed at their objective and win the game, where they can actually pass on various traits or items or things like that to the next character that you create, which is kind of a cool system, but when it starts out and you don't have access to the upgraded lodgings, you don't really get that many options for it. So to get to the point where you can actually pass something pretty significant on, what you need to do is you need to get the upgraded lodgings, which cost you 1,000 echoes. Echoes are the currency in this game, and it can take quite a while to get up to 1,000 echoes. And then once you have 1,000 echoes, you have the big question. Do I spend these echoes on getting upgraded lodgings, or do I get a better ship? Now the thing is, once you get the upgraded lodgings, you can also eventually get access to a will that will actually give the next character that you create the upgraded lodgings and basically whatever you had from the previous characters. So that's pretty cool, but at the same time it still feels incredibly grindy in that particular respect. And when you actually get out into the proper gameplay itself, it's really not that compelling. What you're basically doing is moving around the Untersee very, very slowly, even when your speed is maxed out and even when you push your engines to the absolute limit. And so it takes a pretty long time to get from point A to point B, all the while you're having to make sure that your fuel stocks are enough to actually power the engines. Obviously, the more you push your engines, the more fuel you're going to be using up, so you need to make sure you always have some, and if you don't have any, you're just dead in the water. And you also need to make sure that your supplies are also well stocked, because if you run out of supplies, then you'll start starving, and then your crew will start eating each other. So the core gameplay loop itself actually becomes very, very tedious. So even though you're really engrossed in the writing, you're just like, oh, I have to take this across the Untersee to this really, really far away location. Joy. And things get worse when you get into combat, particularly when you have the starting ship, because you only have your one weapon. And basically what ends up happening is you have to get the enemy within range, and whether this is an enemy ship or a sea monster of some description. And as long as they're within the light radius that you emit, then you actually get a targeting solution a lot quicker, whereas if they're not in that headlight, then you actually can't get a very quick target acquisition. It goes up a lot more slowly, as long as they're still within the range of the attack, of course. And you basically just wait until it fills the meter up, and then once it's filled up, you can fire with a 100% hit chance. You can, of course, fire the weapon before you actually get that full targeting solution, but generally speaking, it's a better idea to wait so you are guaranteed a hit instead of firing when you don't have a full firing solution and it's probably gonna miss. And while there is some maneuvering involved in the combat itself, it quickly devolves into this very, very tedious loop of just waiting, click, or press the button to fire, wait, fire, wait, fire. It just gets very, very boring. And I think that's what's ultimately going to make or break this thing for you. The core gameplay loop of going from point A to point B and fighting things is ridiculously boring. The real strength of the game is in its writing, which means that you have to be extremely patient with the mechanics in order to get to that. Now, there are a few things that do kind of spice things up a bit, and those mostly revolve around the officers that you can get, where they're unique characters that fit into special crew slots and give you different bonuses, and you can talk to them, and if you have secrets, which are gained by collecting fragments, which you can basically term up as experience points, really, in order to get a secret, which is basically a skill point, but you can also spend it on other things. And the idea is that you can use this secret and talk to one of your officers in order to actually be able to improve your various stats so that you can actually succeed more readily at the various encounters that you do. It's still a random chance to some degree, but the more you have in a given skill that it requires, the more likely you are to succeed at it, obviously. And there are a couple of interesting side mechanics as well, like the ability to trade things in lieu of cash. In fact, in some places, all you can trade are things that are not cash. For example, there was one merchant I ran into where they only accept stories as payment. And so you have to deliberately go around and find as many stories as you possibly can in order to buy the things that they offer, which are very, very valuable. And some things don't even let you progress beyond a certain point unless you have certain items that you have collected over the course of the game. So that's a fairly interesting idea, but it is something you had to get used to because not a whole lot of games actually do something like that. And then there's the idea of becoming more and more afraid as you continue your journeys and explore things and just kind of go out into the deep, dark parts parts of the Unterzee, and it's dark and it's scary. So obviously your fear level is going to rise. And the higher it gets, the worse things happen. Eventually you start getting racked by nightmares. Eventually, if you manage to max out the meter, you can actually go completely insane. So that does help to improve the risk-reward factor of this game and the exploration that you'll be doing. But like all of the mechanics, it really becomes more of a matter of tedious management than it does actually an interesting gameplay element. And thus, it really does fall to the writing to pick things up. And if the writing doesn't do anything for you, this game's not going to do anything for you. But for those of you who are able to put up with the rather tedious gameplay and really do manage to get into the writing, then you'll find that it actually has quite a bit to offer, and you'll probably enjoy it quite a lot. But really, that's up to you. If after this video you are very interested in the game, I'd say try it out. You'll probably be able to get something out of it. And if after watching this video and hearing about how it is, you're turned off by it, well, it's probably not your kind of thing. And if you're one of those people who's on the fence, maybe you should just wait until it goes on sale. It might be worth picking up for you then. But when it comes down to it, the gameplay loop had me personally bored within moments, but the writing was interesting enough that I just kept going regardless. And while I think I got my fill of the game over the free weekend, your mileage may vary. I will of course have a link in the video description box to where you can find this on Steam if you're interested. Thanks for watching.